Now, yesterday, Alan Horn, the chief creative officer with Disney, announced that Kevin Feige, president of Marvel Studios and mastermind behind the MCU, would be producing a new Star Wars movie, and not a whole lot of details were given about it beyond that, other than what he said in this quote, that with the close of the Skywalker saga, Kathy, and he's of course referring to Kathleen Kennedy, is pursuing a new era in Star Wars storytelling, and knowing what a diehard fan Kevin is, it made sense for these two extraordinary producers to work on a Star Wars film together. Okay, so first of all, just let me say I'm a huge fan of the MCU. What Kevin Feige and company accomplished with Marvel is one of, if not the most impressive feats in the history of film, making 22, now 23 and soon to be more, movies that all slowly but surely built one larger overarching story that culminated in Avengers Endgame, which then became the highest grossing film of all time, is something I don't think anyone, save perhaps Feige, could have ever envisioned happening, much less made a reality, and it's very unlikely we'll ever see anything quite like it again. That being said, I'm sure Disney would love to see Star Wars become something remotely like that, and likely initially purchased Lucasfilm with that very intent, though when they did buy Lucasfilm in October of 2012, they may not have realized or imagined at the time just how successful the MCU would ultimately become. Nevertheless, back then, they'd seen the kind of success the first phase of the MCU had, culminating, of course, with the first Avengers movie, which was a smash hit at the box office, and thus they saw the power or money-making potential of the shared universe concept, and hence they bought Star Wars, which already had a shared universe and huge fan base in place, and figured it could easily be turned into a money-making machine that constantly churned out movies, shows, and merchandise, though Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, has also acknowledged that part of the reason he purchased Lucasfilm was so that no one else could get their hands on Star Wars. Anyway, though there's no denying the first three Star Wars films under Disney were financial successes, the fourth one, however, that being Solo, actually lost money and made it clear that Star Wars was going to be trickier to handle than the MCU, where a character-based movie made up the foundation of the whole franchise. In other words, just taking a character like Han Solo, arguably one of the most popular in all of Star Wars, and making a movie about him wasn't going to work the same way it did with Marvel. And so Bob Iger announced a short time after the failure of Solo that a slowdown in Star Wars movies was coming, citing Star Wars fatigue or too much Star Wars in too short a period of time as the main problem, though I think most fans would argue it has nothing to do with quantity, but everything to do with quality. And so wanting to make Star Wars a truly quality product again, not to mention to be able to support a large quantity at the same time, I think this is where Kevin Feige comes into the picture, and his success with Marvel is what they're really looking at here. Because even though he's only been announced to be producing one movie, I'd have to imagine this might be the first step into a larger role with Lucasfilm for Feige, with there even being the possibility he could take over as president of the company when Kathleen Kennedy's contract expires in 2021. Though that would of course make one ask the question, what about Marvel? Who would take over for them if Feige leaves for Lucasfilm? Or would he somehow oversee both Star Wars and the MCU? Or could it even be possible that after Endgame here, Disney is anticipating a decline in the MCU and wants to see if Star Wars can now enjoy a similar run to what the MCU enjoyed in its first decade, and that Feige is the guy who could make all that happen? Or is it also possible that this will just be a one-and-done project for Feige with Star Wars just to get people excited for future Star Wars movies again? I mean, let's be real here. For a good portion of the fan base right now, there isn't a whole lot to be excited about, at least in terms of future movies. A lot of fans simply will never see or support a trilogy of films brought to us by Rian Johnson, and he was, of course, promised a trilogy shortly before The Last Jedi came out. A trilogy that rarely gets talked about by anyone but Rian Johnson himself. Then there's also David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, the showrunners from Game of Thrones, who were announced last year in February to be producing a whole series of Star Wars films, until earlier this year they signed a $250 million deal with Netflix, which has left their future with Star Wars up in the air. Not to mention, a lot of fans weren't so happy about them getting into Star Wars after how they handled the ending of Game of Thrones. So basically, if you weren't a fan of The Last Jedi and or didn't enjoy the ending or Season 8 of Game of Thrones, well, you pretty much had nothing to be happy about or look forward to in regards to Star Wars films. However, there's obviously a huge crossover between Marvel and Star Wars fans, and announcing that the guy who brought us the MCU was now going to do a Star Wars movie is something that Disney figured most, if not almost all, Star Wars fans could be excited about, even if he's working alongside Kathleen Kennedy, another less than beloved figure in the fan base. And honestly, love or hate Kennedy, it's the perfect time for someone new to come in and be the face of Lucasfilm. With the Skywalker saga ending and the franchise moving into totally new, uncharted territory, it's time for someone else to step up and lead it into that future that isn't associated with what many see as a rocky start under Disney. This then lets Kennedy forever be the poster child of this current era of Star Wars, and lets those who have been happy with or loved what she's done look back at this time period with fond remembrance, and lets those who haven't been happy with it feel like Star Wars is hitting the reset button with someone new, someone they like from someplace else. As for how I personally feel about Feige potentially taking over the reins at Lucasfilm, well, as I said, I've been a huge fan of the MCU. I also can't deny his success with it. The guy loves Marvel, and it's shined through in every story or every movie in the MCU, and certainly in the overall story, which has been a weakness with Star Wars, a grand vision, I should say. He's also apparently a huge fan of Star Wars, so if he can do anything for it like he did with Marvel, then I'll be one of the first to happily welcome him aboard. And look, as I said before, them immediately saying that he'll be working alongside Kennedy, to me, not only does that mean she'll be grooming him in a sense, or implied to be grooming him, because I don't really know that running the MCU for over a decade hasn't prepared this guy for just about anything. Anyway, I think the idea here is for Kennedy, after having worked with Feige for a bit or 2 years, to then be able to give him her personal blessing or seal of approval when her current contract with Lucasfilm expires in 2 years, and she willingly steps down and basically is the one who promotes him. Because honestly, and I hate to even have to go here, but if Feige takes over for Kennedy, you will have some that complain that a white man is being given a position that belonged to a woman. That's just a reality of the world in which we live today, and hence Disney will do all they can to mitigate the negative reaction from some when or if this all happens. And the best way to do that is to make it look like this was Kennedy's plan or her decision. Because let's just never mind the fact that arguably nobody on planet Earth would be more qualified to helm Lucasfilm than Kevin Feige after all the experience he garnered with the MCU and what he did for that franchise, and how he turned it into the most successful thing, well, in the history of film, if we're being honest. Let's just focus on his gender and the color of his skin, not his qualifications. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Is this the first step to something bigger for Kevin Feige with Lucasfilm? Could you see him taking over someday? Would you even want to see that someday? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.